this computer. Done.
Yeah. That you have to share afterwards.
Sure. My pleasure.
And ma'am, थोड़ा सा ना, you don't mind please voice loud थोड़ा सा ना, या तो कंप्यूटर आपको माइक पास में लाना होगा.
मैं माइक की वॉइस रेज कर देती हूँ.
हाँ, या वॉइस बिल्कुल तेज कर लीजिए मैम.
So I'll speak a little bit louder. Is this better?
Yeah, ma'am. You are the only speaker. जितना वो loud होता है उतना clear आएगी voice मैम.
So ठीक है. I will speak a little louder and tell me if this is okay. Is this okay?
Yeah,
it's okay.
Yeah. So now we come to the anatomy, and when we talk about the anatomy, we need to be aware of. So there are two aspects we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the masticator space, and we need to be aware of the muscles in this region. So this is the masseter muscle. This is the temporalis muscle. This muscle is critical for us, as we'll discuss later. This muscle is attached to the medial aspect of the mandible, and then it goes superiorly, as we will see a little bit later. This is the pterygoid muscle. Then these are the levator and the tensor veli palatini, and these two muscles are the longus capitis muscle and the rectus capitis muscle. So these are the muscles that we need to be aware of in this region. And the other thing that we need to be aware of is the masticator space. So the masticator space, as you can see here, is a deep facial space. And this is very important for us. Number one, we need to know the fact that this freely communicates with the external temporal fossa. Then we also, now we need, when we see this in cross section, we understand why this is important to us. We know that buccal mucosa lesions, retromolar trigone lesions, alveolar lesions have a tendency to involve the masticator space. And so we need to understand what the masticator space is. So this is the masseter, this is the mandible, this is the medial pterygoid muscle. But what we also need to note is that this communicates superiorly with the temporalis muscle. So these are the boundaries of this space, and this is the masseter. It's a bit light colored, but you can see this lavender colored. So this is the lower extent, the masseter and the lower end of the mandible. Then we come up, this is the masticator space. Again, the masticator space in this area, the masticator space in this area, and then again the masticator space. So this is a space that we need to be aware of, because this is a space that is at risk when we are treating buccal mucosa lesions. So as we know that involvement is classified as T4B disease, this is a complex anatomic areas, and tumors may have, as I already discussed, different outcomes depending on whether they are supranotch or infranotch. And we should not classify anyone who has an involvement in the posterior part as inoperable and fit only for palliative treatment or only for concurrent chemoradiation. So I've already discussed this. Why is this space so important? This space is important because this communicates with areas which are risky for a buccal mucosa or an alveolar or an RNT cancer. These are the three cancers when we talk about buccoalveolar cancers. These are the three cancers that we are interested in. So through this space, these cancers can travel to the ITF and then to the foramen ovale. They can also, maxillary sinus tumors can involve the suborbital canal, and that is how they can track to the maxillary nerve and then to the foramen rotundum. Through the palatine foramen, they can involve, when there are lesions involving the hard palate. This is how through the palatine foramen they travel to the maxillary nerve. And of course, the most important thing also, for the track of the maxillary nerve, we have to know about the pterygopalatine fossa. So this is the kind of anatomical importance that the masticator space in the infratemporal fossa have. And that brings us to the pattern of spread of this tumor. So one is that it may have local spread to the adjacent structures, which may lead to the invasion of underlying soft tissue muscles, bone and neurovascular structures. I will read through this entire slide because this is important. Gingivobuccal complex tumors extend along the surface mucosa and the submucosal soft tissue to approach the buccal or the labial gingivum. So any buccal mucosa lesion can also involve the gingivum. We know that it is important for us to assess the gingivobuccal sulcus for this reason. Besides that, what is important to note is that the periosteum forms a barrier, and so these tumors do not go directly into the cancellous bone, but in fact go through the dental sockets and the dental pores, and I'll come to that slightly later. And once they've involved the mandible, then they can travel along the mandibular canal. So they can travel in the cancellous part of the bone and along the mandibular canal, to distances in the mandibular canal, which is the basis of the various procedures, the segmental mandibulectomy, the hemimandibulectomy, which actually incorporate this fact that the tumor can travel through the cancellous part of the bone and through the mandibular canal. So buccal mucosa lesions will progress differently as compared to alveolar and retromolar trigone lesions. So buccal mucosa lesions will involve the buccinator muscle and the buccal fat pad. Alveolar and retromolar trigone lesions will involve the bone early, that is natural. Besides the mandibular canal in the inferior alveolar nerve, we know in the maxillary antrum, the floor of the nose, and the maxillary sinus, these are the possible, for upper alveolar lesions, these are the possible routes of spread. Then one very important thing to note is that absence of fixation of bone or small size of a mandibular lesion does not rule out bone involvement. Infratemporal fossa I have already touched upon, and we will discuss it in slightly greater detail later. So this is the mental nerve, travels through the mandibular canal, the inferior alveolar nerve, and it touches along the medial border of the mandible and then goes across the the masticator space to go into the foramen ovale. So this is something that we need to be aware of when we are drawing our targets. And this is the method of involvement in the mandible in the absence of cortical involvement. So even in the absence of cortical erosion, through the dental socket in a patient who has teeth and through the dental pores in an edentulous patient, the mandible can be involved. The other thing that we need to be aware of is perineural spread. So this is perhaps because of the path of least resistance. The tumor cells can travel through the neural pathway or adjacent to the perineurium, and so then we need to be aware lower when we are talking about the mandible, mandibular branch, the maxillary branch, the various branches of these two cranial nerves we have to be aware of and their pathway. So one important point I'd like you to note here is the auricular temporal nerve and how its distribution actually takes us superiorly. The other thing, of course, that is very important when we are treating anyone who has involvement of the upper part of the skin is the fact that the intraorbital nerve is going to be at risk. The facial nerve is also something that we need to be aware of. Why is it important? Why is it important for us as radiation oncologists to be aware of this? We need to be aware of this because there is an impact on the locoregional control of perineural spread that can actually be improved by the addition of radiation. So in this group of patients, 88 patients in post-operative oral cancers, squamous cell carcinoma, N0 patients when studied for PNI, it was found that 23% of patients may have PNI, and the addition of radiotherapy dramatically improves their median survival. We also know that for perineural invasion, the dose prescription for tongue has been recommended in the textbook as 66 Gray. We also know from Dr. Anand's excellent paper on gingivobuccal sulcus tumors that perineural invasion continues to be a risk factor of patients undergoing radiation. So again, when we are drawing the target, we need to know how these nerve pathways go. So the maxillary nerve arises from the trigeminal ganglion, travels along the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, passes through the foramen rotundum, which is just superior to this area, then passes through the upper part of the pterygopalatine fossa, which is here, then passes through the inferior orbital fissure, which is this one, and then exits the orbit through the inferior orbital foramen. So this is how it travels. The nerve travels through here and then comes out in this area. So this is the maxillary nerve, and this is how its involvement shows up. So this is a lesion in the pterygopalatine fossa. This is a lesion failure in the infraorbital nerve. And this is a widening of the foramen rotundum. We don't see it on this side, but we see it on the other side. So this is the foramen rotundum and a widening of the foramen rotundum indicating disease. Now the other heart, if the heart palate is involved, then we need to be aware of the greater and the lesser palatine nerves. The greater and the lesser palatine nerves exit through the palatine foramina and then travel along the Vidian canal. So this is just posterior to the pterygopalatine fissure. Just posterior to the pterygopalatine fissure is the Vidian canal. And for a lot of this, we will, whenever we have a patient who has perineural involvement, it is important to involve our radiology colleagues to help us in the target delineation of these patients. Now we come to the mandibular nerve. Of course, we know that of the various buccoalveolar cancer subsites, which are buccal mucosa, gingivobuccal sulcus, alveolus, and retromolar trigone, the lower gingivobuccal sulcus is the most common site of disease, and this is, of course, where we have to track and trace the mandibular nerve, especially if the mandible is involved. So arises from the trigeminal ganglia, exits from the foramen ovale, exits into the infratemporal fossa, and then divides into the lingual and the inferior alveolar nerve. So if we see this patient whose failure we have tracked, cavernous sinus, exiting through the foramen ovale, and then coming medially along the mandible. So can you hear me? Can you see this? And then in this place, we see where the mandibular nerve lies in this patient who has had a failure, or where the foramen ovale is in relation to the contralateral side. We can see the failure site here. So this is how the mandibular nerve presents.
Put on the fan.
Is everything, can you hear me? Is everything all right? Do I need to unmute somebody to find that out?
There is a one iPhone connected. Can you mute, ma'am? That
I will just do that.
in participant iPhone.
Yeah. So is everything going fine? Dr. Arun? Okay.
Yeah, now it is fine. Okay, continue.
Great. Great. Yeah. So yeah. So so this is how it is. So this actually tells us the location of the mandibular nerve. Now, facial nerve, it has many parts. Cisternal, in the internal acoustic meatus, labyrinthine, tympanitic, and mastoid. It comes out into the facial canal, exits from the brainstem into the internal acoustic meatus, and then there is a segment which lies along the medial wall of the middle ear. Then it comes down straight, and then finally travels out. So this is in the internal ear, the middle ear, I'm sorry. Then the stylomastoid foramen, and then exits into the parotid. So this is basically the track of the facial nerve, and then of course from the facial, and then from the parotid it spreads along to the cheek. This is the facial nerve on MRI. The anterior part is the facial nerve, the posterior part is the vestibular cochlear nerve, and this is the canal in which they both travel together. So these basically, of course, we need to know all the foramina for other reasons, but for buccoalveolar complex, we need to be aware of the foramen rotundum, which is the maxillary nerve exit, and the foramen ovale, which is the mandibular nerve exit. So in summary, we need to see for involvement of the cheek, the gingivum, the alveolus, the RMT, mandible, maxilla, buccal fat pad, skin, masticator space, infratemporal fossa, perineural involvement, floor of the mouth. Whenever the mandible is involved, we need to be aware of the involvement of the floor of the mouth. Similarly, also of the hard palate and lymph nodes. So, naturally, we are interested as for all head and neck cancers, we would like to know the pattern of lymph node spread. So, typically, these tumors are not they do not involve the level 5 nodes or even level 4 nodes if they are N0. So if clinically they are N0, then they are likely to involve only level 1, 2, and 3. So you see gum, retromolar trigone, cheek, there is very little involvement of level 4. As you know from Gregoire et al., it has been postulated that only levels in which if the involvement is more than 5%, does that level need to be treated. However, when we come to patients who have clinically more involvement, then there is a significant involvement of level 4 also. So that is something that we need to be aware of. So ipsilateral neck, yes, but when do we treat the contralateral neck? So one of the things that has been suggested is that in all T4 patients, we should treat the contralateral neck. Not necessarily, I don't necessarily agree with that. But yes, if patients have multiple metastatic nodes, if there are 2 or more nodes involved, if there are alveolar lesions that are close to the midline, or if the lesion infiltrates through the floor of the mouth, then in that case, we do need to treat level 1, 2, and 3 of the contralateral side. Then, of course, we need to know how to read the histopathology report, what to read in the histopathology report, and how we are going to apply it, or what we are going to apply it for. So one is, of course, the T stage. The T stage will help us decide whether we want to give radiation or not. And we will use that information to also do a risk stratification. Perineural invasion, it determines the risk of recurrence, but also may impact our target delineation. It may impact our dose. At least personally, I treat all patients with perineural invasion to 66 Gray. It may decide the addition of chemotherapy, and I'll touch upon that slightly later. In fact, let me touch upon it right now. So we know that for the meta-analysis of Bernier and Cooper showed that concurrent chemoradiation was helpful in patients who are either ECE positive or margin positive. However, in the European part of the trial, the Bernier trial, there had been significant benefit of adding chemotherapy in patients with perineural invasion, lymphovascular space invasion, oral cavity tumors with level 4 involvement. So there is a school of thought that these patients should be offered chemotherapy, especially if they are young people in good fitness. And even in the NCCN guidelines, it is mentioned as in the consider chemotherapy section. So this is something that we need to discuss within our multidisciplinary tumor boards as well as with the patient. Then, of course, lymphovascular space invasion, again, is associated with higher risk of recurrence, and we will take a decision about adding chemotherapy. Same reasoning as perineural invasion. Margin, of course, determines the risk of recurrence, the dose, because you'll go up to 66 Gray, and the addition of chemotherapy. Then worst pattern of invasion. So if somebody has a worst pattern of invasion 5, even in a tumor which is less than 2 centimeters in size, they have almost a 40% chance of local recurrence. And therefore, this is a group of patients that should be considered for radiotherapy at least. Involvement of the skin will, of course, change the stage, but will also determine during planning whether we want to use a bolus and whether we want to do target delineation. It will impact how we are going to delineate the target, because we will definitely include the skin and treat it to a high dose. Location of the lesion. So the location of the lesion, of course, the target delineation is going to be different for an upper alveolar lesion, and I'll touch upon that a little later. Involvement of the floor of the mouth or close to the midline may influence the decision for treating the contralateral neck. Lymph node number, presence, and the presence of ECE will decide the dose, the chemotherapy, ECE presence, and decision whether to treat the contralateral neck or not. So these are some of the factors that we need to look at when we are reading the histopathology report of the patient. And then, of course, before drawing the target, we need to be aware of the pattern of failure. So as compared to tongue cancer, in this group of 936 patients reported from Memorial Sloan Kettering, we find that the locoregional relapse-free survival is 7% less, 7 to 8% less in patients who have gingival cancers vis-a-vis tongue malignancies. Their regional relapse-free survival is less, actually. Survival is better, but the disease-specific survival and the local regional relapse-free survival are both poorer in gingival sulcus patients, underlining the importance of local control and therefore the importance of drawing the local target properly. So, of course, we know that we have been identifying, marginal, local, marginal, and out-of-field failures, depending on whether 95% of the centroid of the recurrent lesion lies within the target volume, 20 to 95 lying within the target volume would qualify as a marginal failure, and less than 20% qualifies as out-of-field failure. I'm just explaining that for the youngsters in the audience, the participants, to understand that this is something critical that is very important in head and neck cancer. Excuse me. Then, of course, is the differentiation, which I've already touched upon, local, regional, and distant, and the fact that local recurrences are the major component. Local recurrences are the major component in gingival buccal cancers. Regional are less, both together, you can see. So 24 out of 28 patients have had some form of local recurrence. Contralateral neck failures are less. So it's very interesting. This was a further differentiation from Abdullah et al., which looked at classifying failures into failure in the middle of the high dose volume, failure in the edge of the high dose volume, failure in the middle of the intermediate dose volume, failure at the edge of the intermediate dose volume, and so on. But what they want to tell us is that each of these failures means a different thing. If there's a failure within the high dose volume, local, 95% within the high dose volume, then it is a question of biology. It is not a question of your target delineation. But if it has failed within or at the edge of your high dose volume, then it is a target delineation issue. Similarly, if it has failed entirely within the intermediate dose volume, then it is an improper risk stratification. So this area should actually have been in the high dose volume. So it's quite an interesting way of looking like a deep dive into understanding failures in the gingival buccal sulcus area. And again, I'd like you to note here the number of failures. So they have identified that 55% of their patients failed within the high dose target, but 45% failed outside the high dose target. And most of them failed either in the ipsilateral buccal mucosa, lower alveolus lesion failing in the upper alveolus, masticator space, foramen rotundum, ovale, pterygopalatine fossa, orbit, etc. Again, from India, there is this data from Tata Memorial Center in Calcutta. Their patients did undergo ITF clearance. I spoke with Dr. Indranil to find out they treat all their upper alveolar and their T3, T4s. They include the ITF 260K, and yet they had about certain number of 6 patients failing in the ITF. So now coming to illustrating the patterns of failure. Now we've understood how these patients fail, and I'll just show you a few pictures. So this is a high ITF failure. So as you can understand, in the Proton Center, we are in a position where we are seeing a great number of recurrent lesions, and it has helped us build a kind of a small album. So this is the site of failure. Now this patient has received dose to the ITF, to the masticator space, but not to the high ITF. And this is where he has failed. He had an upper alveolar lesion. And you can see why. So if this is the temporalis muscle, it's going to track along the temporalis muscle and reach here. So that is how this patient has failed in this area. This is another failure. You could see the pterygopalatine fissure superior to that, and then here cavernous sinus, and so we see this failure. This is the failure, and the radiation dose was just a cut below this, but actually this patient had a failure right inside. Most of the volume was actually inside the previously treated area. This I'm just showing you for an extension where the patients fail. Edge of the flap. Edge of the flap. This is another place for failure. And contralateral neck node. Dermis failure. Failure in the dermis, in spite of the fact that you can make out from the coloring of this patient, the skin has been treated, but the dermis fails. The scar is another area where the patient may fail. This is a patient who had very aggressive disease with perineural invasion and a recurrent lesion. So within the flap, if we have covered the flap properly, that is a failure of biology, maybe because of hypoxic cells being present there. Cut end of the mandible. I didn't get a picture of this, though I have it somewhere in my mail. But cut end of the mandible, we really need to pay attention to when we are drawing our target. Then there is a postulate that we need to treat antegrade in a patient who has a heavy burden of perineural invasion, such as the involvement of the main nerve or diffuse PNI. Maybe we need to treat the skin, the dermis. This has been postulated by Dr. Anand as well as a couple of other authors who have published in the Green Journal, that perhaps we need to pay attention to antegrade PNI and treat the subcutaneous, the dermis and the epidermis till the midline. And of course, lymph node failures are something that we need to be aware of. So now we come to the indications of radiotherapy. Of course, adverse features in presence of T1, T2 disease such as LBSI, PNI, WPI, worst pattern of invasion, 5, positive close margins. Mostly we take less than 5 mm as positive close margin. One positive node may not have an impact on survival, but I do believe that it is good for us to consider radiation in this because local recurrence is actually associated with...
I did not deliver and whatever was there was finished.
Yeah, I think somebody's come on.
Hardly a bottle of water is even.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Ma'am, actually, if you think somebody is disturbing you...
No, it's all right. It's all right. I've dealt with it. Not a problem. Yeah. So, in one node positive, possibly there's no significant impact on the survival. The various studies tell us that there is, a 10% difference in survival, which was non-significant. But there is a significant impact on the local recurrence, and for that reason, we should consider. Then, of course, the obvious ones, T3, T4, N2 plus disease. We can also risk stratify, and this is actually not only for buccal mucosa, but this is for all head and neck cancers when we are doing post-operative radiotherapy. So this is a 90% chance of local control, 80% chance of local control, and this is just under 70% chance of local control. Then we come to so this is what is the build-up to actually delivering, to doing the contours of the patient. So we have to understand all this when we are sitting down to draw the target for these patients. I just need to see if somebody needs to be muted. Yeah, done. So, ideally we should immobilize with a 5-clamp thermoplastic mask because there is the least amount of play within the mask, but a 4-clamp mask made nicely is also okay. It's very important to put a wire on the scars. The wires are critical to identify the medial extent, the posterior auricular extent, and the inferior limit of the scar. They are also critical. You may choose to bolus the scar also because this is one of the areas where there is a chance of failure. So depending on the institutional protocol, one can scan at 2 or 3 millimeters. We should consider a mouth bite for upper alveolar lesions. Why we must consider a mouth bite for the upper alveolar lesions, in spite of the fact that we might be treating the 1B node, is that otherwise the tongue will be in apposition to the palate and we may end up giving a very high dose and causing mucositis and dysgeusia. So in spite of the fact that we may be treating the 1B nodes, we can still create a cold spot over the tongue, and therefore it's important to consider a mouth bite. We also try, excuse me, as far as possible, we try to use one for mandibular lesions also, to deviate the tongue, to reduce the possibility of side effects. And I have a picture of that slightly later. So it's a good idea to give contrast to delineate the nodes. It's interesting. So recently I was reading I was going through there's a YouTube tutorial by Brian O'Sullivan of Princess Margaret Hospital, and I would encourage a lot of the youngsters to hear that. And he talks about how it's very important to image the patient after post-operative radiotherapy, because you can have surprises. The surgeon may have left something, or the tumor may have very bad biology and it may have grown. So also consider a bolus, a 3 millimeter bolus in case the skin is infiltrated or if there is ECE. As I said, we must bolus the scar, but as far as possible, we do not bolus the lower neck scar, because the lower neck is, as it is prone to developing more mucosal reactions, and is that the scar in that area, unless the patient is node positive, is anyway at a lower risk. In case the patient has dental artifacts, it can create a problem in target delineation. And it can also create a problem in assigning Hounsfield units. So wherever there is MVCT available, one may use an MVCT to correctly identify exactly the dental artifact, and also replace the Hounsfield units manually. So this is one of the things that one can do in oral cavity tumors. So now when we set out to draw out the clinical target volume, we have 3 dose levels: the high risk, the low risk, and the very high risk. So 16-30 is the usual. We can do a sequential plan, 15-25, or more likely, as is happening these days, we do a SIP plan. A SIP plan also has better sparing of the OAR, because it's happening as one in one plan itself. And we normally, that is what we practice, 54 gray and 30 fractions is 52 to 54 gray is what we usually practice. In certain areas, we would require 66 gray and 33 fractions when there is a positive margin, if there is an ECE, and personally, I do it also for pedineural invasion. So what is the CTV 60 gray? First, we need to delineate the tumor bed. Then we need to delineate the flap plus 1 centimeter distal to the scar in all directions. Superiorly, this may be controversial, but I include the entire infrazygomatic infratemporal fossa up to the base of skull, the masticator space, the infratemporal fossa, pterygopalatine fissure in the 60 gray volume. Laterally, include the masticator space and reach up to the skin. Treat up to the skin using a bolus in case the skin is infiltrated and in case query of PNI. In other situations, we may clip the skin 3 millimeters from the skin. Inferiorly, the lower limit of the 60 gray volume is a level 3 nodal level or flap plus 1 centimeter, whichever is lower. Treat the upper neck to 60 gray and the lower neck, this is again, I put it in brackets because this can be a matter of opinion. A lot of people treat the entire neck on the same side to 60 gray. However, for example, if we have a buccal lesion with a good sopromohoid neck dissection, 16 to 18 nodes removed, then in that case, the lower neck either need not be treated or can be treated to 50 gray or equivalent. But of course, there's no doubt that when if the node is positive, then the entire neck needs to be treated to 60 gray. For RMT lesions, we must include the ipsilateral tonsil and the tonsillar pillars and the lateral pharyngeal wall. And this, again, is a very interesting article, which I would encourage all the youngsters to read, from Chakrabarti et al., the PJR of 2015, where he has discussed the target delineation and has also cited how they have learned from their failures and started including the ITF, and the guidelines that had been given before that had actually discussed only a lesion plus 2 centimeters. But that is actually not correct for a buccoalveolar cancer for the reasons that I have also just covered before this. So this is how we would draw the target. This is the wire. This is the wire. This may be the wire of the flap. There would be another wire for the posterior extent of the scar in the neck. And then we would include the flap. We would go 1 centimeter, at least 1 centimeter across. On the other side, we would include the mandible and at least 1 centimeter of the floor of the mouth, 1 to 1.5 centimeter of the floor of the mouth. Now, this was a young man who had a 2 centimeter tumor with one margin which is plus minus closed and involvement of 2 out of 45 lymph nodes. So extranodal spread is not present. So we treated him 260 gray, and this is serially, as you can see lower down, the flap is very bulky, so, but we have come down and covered the flap even, this is at the level of the thyroid cartilage, and then posteriorly ensuring that the flap is covered completely and the posterior auricular nodes are covered completely. Again, the flap and the upper gingivobuccal sulcus and the masticator space. The lower neck, in this case, treated to 60 gray because of the node positive. The contralateral neck being treated because of N+ status of the ipsilateral neck. So there are two aspects I'd like to discuss here. One is the difference, of course, that on this side the neck node is not involving level 5, and the fact that here we are going traditionally as we would for treating the neck, as per the various atlases. However, on the side which has been disrupted by surgery, it's very important that we treat the entire space that has been disrupted by the surgeons. We do not respect the sternocleidomastoid in this area. One is much more liberal about, making sure that the scar area and all that are encompassed in our field, as you can see here, the wire. Superiorly, we have included the temporalis muscle, as you can see here. So now this is the 60 gray volume, the bulky flap, the masticator space, the lower neck. This, the suprazygomatic part, is included in the 50 gray volume, and this, the contralateral neck, is in the 50 gray volume. And if we are sibbing, of course, it will go up to 54 gray. So this, in sum, is how we would draw the target for a buccoalveolar lesion, and the reasons why we would draw the target in this manner I've already specified. So we have to pay attention to how the mandible has been treated. Is it a marginal? Is it hemi? Is it segmental? So in a hemimandibulectomy, we must include the cut end of the mandible plus go another 1 centimeter. We must include 1.5 centimeters, 1 to 1.5 centimeter to the medial edge of the flap at the floor of the mouth region. In the segmental, again, we should not just include the mandible, but we must come to the midline. Marginal mandibulectomy, again, I would come to the midline. Ensure adequate coverage posterior to the mandible in the midline. Sometimes we tend to make a very narrow target in that area, so we must ensure that our target, the brush, is at least 1 centimeter when we are going posterior to the midline. What is the CTB low risk? The lower neck in an adequately dissected N0 neck. This is plus minus. A lot of people would treat it to 60, but I do treat this area to 50, 54 when we are sibbing. Suprazygomatic ITF and the contralateral neck if it is being treated. This is another patient. This patient had an ulcer in the retromolar trigone. This was an ulcerative lesion, right RMT, 3 to 2 centimeters, involving the right buccal mucosa and the lower gingivobuccal sulcus. Biopsy from the ulcerative lesion revealed a moderately differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. A CT neck, this was the right RMT lesion, he had neck nodes involved. He underwent a wide local excision, a right segmental mandibulectomy, and a right upper alveolectomy. So, right MRND. Interestingly, this was, all cut margins were negative. The lateral margin is closed. Then there's a revised lateral margin. And then he's P&I positive. He doesn't have worse pattern of spread 5, but the tumor is infiltrating the mandibular cortical bone, not involving the upper alveolar bone, which has been taken for margins. So again, we see here, we have included the flap. We have come posteriorly. So all areas where there is any disruption post-operatively has to be included at the target. We have included the oropharyngeal region here, the tonsillar fossa, and then come across the cut end of the mandible. It is important to come across the cut end of the mandible. Here, a mouth bite has been used to deviate the tongue. And then we have, we cannot deviate the floor of the mouth. We don't want to deviate the floor of the mouth. But the oral mobile part of the tongue can actually be deviated while we can still insinuate our target into the floor of the mouth area. So where the tongue is attached, as you can see, we have included it in our target. So this is how the target has been drawn. Because the upper alveolus was disrupted, besides the masticated space, we have also included a part of the maxilla in our target. And so slight differentiation between a lower gingivam and the upper gingivam targets. In this particular patient, I did treat him extra to 66 gray, a small area where the lesion was, because there had been a plus minus close margin, there was PNI. It's very arbitrary, 5 mm, 1 centimeter around the margin, around the lesion to about 66 gray. Now we come to delineating the target in the neck. So since the tissue planes are disrupted, we do not treat only under the sternocleidomastoid. We have to remember that, because the surgeons have gone and they have touched the nodes in that area, and there will be some spillage. So that whole area is contaminated. So we may not treat up to the skin if there is no E&E. We may treat 3 millimeters short of the skin, but we still have to treat the entire area, not just under the sternocleidomastoid, but at least where the nodes were involved, we would include the sternocleidomastoid in our entire, region and treat up to just short of the skin. If there is ECE, we must consider bolus to lift the nose up to the skin. Some systems do not require a bolus, but the point that I'm trying to make is that we must consider treating up to the skin. Now, we may not be able to treat up to the skin right through. So these are patients at some point of time after 22, 23 fractions, we may need to remove the bolus, because otherwise the patient would have grade 3 reactions, and then continue the rest of the remaining treatment without using a bolus. So there is some amount of adaptive planning that may be warranted just to keep the skin toxicity down. And finally, I come to the OARs. This is the spine contralateral parotid. Of course, we all know. Submandibular gland becomes critical in these patients because they have already lost one submandibular gland on the ipsilateral side. I personally do not spare the parotid of the ipsilateral side. I believe the skin in that area is at risk, the periparotid nodes are at risk, so I would normally treat the ipsilateral parotid, or not spare it at least. And somewhere earlier when I had shown, Abdullah et al.'s failures, they have actually very nicely shown, a failure in the spared parotid. So I'm a little wary of sparing the parotid on the ipsilateral side. Of course, now we know that we must spare the constrictors, we must spare the contralateral mucosa, buccal mucosa. We must, but there's some value addition beyond that. So when we are talking about going suprazygomatic, we need to worry about the lacrimal gland, we need to worry about the temporal lobe, and we also need to think about the hippocampus, because now we are talking about a disease where there may be 70% survival at the end of 5 years. We have data to suggest 70% survival. We have the OCAT trial from Tata Memorial, Taiwanese data, all suggesting that these patients actually do quite well. So we want very much to, not leave them constrained, especially if we are treating the left side. So the cochlea and the optic apparatus. So it's very important to make a note of the optic apparatus, because you might actually discover that the dose is spilling onto the optic nerve or the retina in this situation. So for the lacrimal gland, we had actually done this analysis, 23 patients of oral cavity and 7 patients of nasopharyngeal carcinoma. Divya from Idriprastha Polo, one of our DNB students, had done this analysis, and it's possible to spare the lacrimal gland even though we are treating very close to it. As you can see, we're treating very close to it, and yet it's possible to spare the lacrimal gland. Then interestingly, fatigue is one of the, corollaries. So fatigue was noted in, fatigue was noted in the Passport trial as a post hoc analysis. It was found that fatigue is an issue in patients who undergo IMRT. And one of the reasons that was thought to be the cause of fatigue was the dose that was being received by the, posterior structures, the posterior brain-related structures. So that was thought to be one of the reasons why there was fatigue. So it is important to pay attention. We shouldn't just settle for a 45 gray is there, so that's good. A brainstem, cerebellum, it's all right if we are not going beyond 54. No, I think there has to be an effort on our part to reduce the dose to these neural structures also. And of course, it's very important to look at the hippocampus. This is something, this has been done by one of my residents, Manish, who's now in Tata Memorial. So he had done this work. We used to not spare the hippocampus, and then we started sparing the hippocampus, and it made a big difference. There was a significant impact on what is the constraint that has been given by Vinay Gandhi, which is D40 EQD2 should be less than, D40% EQD2 should be less than 7.3 gray. So this works out to approximately a little over 16 gray in in this dose fractionation for an alpha beta of 2. So this is something that we need to be cognizant of, that when we are treating so high up, when we are talking about nasopharynx or we are talking about gingival sulcus, that it is important to spare this area. So I come to the end. This is my concluding slide. So this is a 23-year-old mucoepidermoid carcinoma patient who was treated, who was a margin positive intermediate risk resection. He came to us for proton therapy. And I'd like you to pay attention here. This is the proton plan, and this is the spillage. This is the 600 centigrade isodose and the 30 gray, 6 gray and 30 gray isodose. This is the proton plan, and this is the photon plan. So of course we want to achieve a buccal mucosa, contralateral buccal mucosa, mean dose of less than 26 gray. That is associated, at least in oropharyngeal and nasopharyngeal cancers, that is associated with the risk of developing or requiring tube feeding. But it's also critical to reduce mucositis. It is also critical to maintain the quality of life of the patient. And it's also critical, I think, to reducing the risk of second cancers in a young person. And we were very happy to have been able to do that, to apply, whatever one has learned about buccoalveolar cancers, but then use it without treating the contralateral side too much. I would like to, thank all the residents who have helped me, and all my team who have helped me with collecting a lot of the stuff, the pictures, Dr. Vineet, Dr. Utpal, Dr. Grishma in Delhi, and Dr. Mutaya. And these are the articles I recommend that you read. One is, as I already mentioned, Dr. Santam Chakravarti's article, Dr. Anand's article, and the Italian Radiation Oncology Group's guidelines on the use of IMRT in head and neck cancer, where they have also touched upon in great detail about how to treat oral cavity cancers post-operatively. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a comprehensive and very informative lecture. Almost you covered with all questions whatsoever come in the mind, but still there are many questions. If we see the chat box, you can also see chat box. Most of question is full of with selection of nodal value. Whether we treat, how much we treat ipsilateral neck in 60 gray, and when we treat contralateral neck. Can you briefly summarize in this part?
So I'll just go over. Sorry, there's some some sort of pen thing that is coming onto the screen. Sorry, this must be from. Okay, so the indications for treating the contralateral neck are 2 nodes or more. or lesions which are infiltrating the close to the midline, especially in the mandible, even the maxilla. I mean, even the upper alveolus, if there is a lesion, those are rare actually. We don't see so many upper alveolar lesions which are involving the midline. In the mandible area, of course, we may, in lower gingivum, lower alveolar lesions, we may see lesions which are involving in the midline. So those are situations where we would treat the contralateral neck. There are some authors who believe that we should do it for all T4 tumors, and who should do it also, that we should do it also for poorly differentiated tumors. But personally, that is not what I do, and there is no recommendation like that. The recommendation is 2 nodes, or if it is close to the midline.
Okay. When there is a lateralized lesion, but T4, should we treat opposite neck? And if yes, then how much?
So, as I said, I just specified that if it's a very well lateralized lesion, and if there is no involvement of, if it's N0, then we don't need to treat the contralateral neck. For N1, we don't need to treat the contralateral neck. When we do treat the contralateral neck, the rule of thumb is that you treat whatever would have been involved in, if you were what is involved in the ipsilateral side up to 5%. So it would normally be level 1, 2, and 3. Contralateral level 1, 2, and 3.
Okay. And another topic is the bolus, which is very controversial, and mostly it is the individual experience. There is no much guideline about how to use bolus, where to use, and what is the thickness. Then if the skin, you told if skin is involved, then use bolus.
Yes.
Then how much bolus? Whether we include full cheek or it is the area with margin. How you select the extent of bolus, and to how much fractions of bolus?
So I think that's a very valid question. That, for example, if there is skin infiltration, then you need to bolus only the cheek. You don't need to bolus everything else. However, if there is an ECE, for example, in level 2, then you need to bolus only that area. What we normally do is that we use those thin wax strips, and we will fill up the pores of the cast and maybe add another 2. So it's approximately about 3 millimeter or so of bolus. The idea behind that bolus is that the system requires you to have 3 millimeters of spared area. Otherwise, the system is not able to calculate properly. So you want to lift the dose up to the skin, and the bolus is only for that, to allow the system to lift the dose up to the skin. So you don't need more than 2 to 3 millimeters. Not more than 3 millimeters. Now, what for how many fractions it's pretty much going to be based on the patient. But normally I find that at around anywhere between 23 to 25 fractions, you might need to take the bolus off. You might need to. It doesn't happen for everyone. But you have to keep a close eye to see whether this patient is looking like he's developing a grade 3 reaction, in which case you would take the bolus off. So that would be about the critical time where you might need to do an adaptive plan.
Okay. Another area you covered with bolus, where to be added, that is extranodal extension.
Yes.
But mostly in the report, the which node have extranodal extension at what location, it is not mentioned. Then how to select whether we go pre-op imaging, how to identify which node is having extranodal extension, and then we should apply bolus to that area. You can guide. There are a lot of students.
Yeah.
How to
So
select bolus for extranodal extension.
Sure. Generally speaking, this is likely to be in the level 1 to 3 area. So unless a patient has some gross evidence of involvement of level 4 or 5, generally this is in the level 1 to 3 area when we are treating buccoalveolar lesions. So that is approximately the area that we would apply the bolus on the ipsilateral side. So basically, you know, this area is what we would apply the bolus for.
One of the question is, if PNI is not reported, then the perineural invasion sites to be covered in the low risk volume or it to be ignored?
So as I mentioned already, I recommend, I have to say this, that nobody has done this analysis, and this is something that we should say that we have learned on the job. But if we look at the literature, for example, I quoted to you paper from Lai et al. Now, Lai et al. Had 5 failures in the ITF. 1 was in the 60 gray volume, and 4 were in the 50, 51, 52 gray volume. So what I'm trying to say is that personally, I believe that the entire ITF should be treated to the entire masticator space, which is up to the zygoma, should be treated in 60 gray for all patients who have buccal mucosa lesions. That is what I do. And, you know, ever since I've started doing it, I've not encountered any failure in the ITF. It's not that patients don't fail, but they don't fail in the ITF. So I would suggest that everything that is up to the zygoma should be treated to 60 gray, irrespective of whether PNI is present or not, irrespective of whether it's upper alveolar, lower alveolar. That is actually the pattern of spread of this lesion. And secondly, suprazygomatic is what we need to treat to 50 gray.
When this question is posted by Dr. Nayar, do we have to treat whole opposite neck if 2 node is positive?
Level 1, 2, 3 is, you know, so this is let's put 2 nodes as like the area where we don't know the answer. 1 node, you don't have to treat the contralateral side. 3 nodes, you have to treat at least level 1, 2, 3. Yes, in 2 nodes also you would treat level 1, 2, 3. At least I do.
Next question is, ma'am, there are a lot of questions. Please keep answer as short as possible,
Okay.
so that we can cover all questions. Next question is posted, do you include TM joint while treating ITF?
Yes. Ipsilateral, yes.
So, okay. Then if yes, then whether how is going to increase the possibility of trismus? Is any experience including of TM joint is going to increase future trismus?
So from the very beginning, I think we have to introduce these patients into various kind of mouth opening and swallowing exercises. And that is what I can't say that the trismus is more a function of how good the flap is. So the flap is not a good flap. You know, if it's a very tight flap in the beginning itself, then this patient is going to have trismus. I don't think there is too much that we have encountered from the point of view of radiation in this situation. But if the patient has a good flap, then these are patients who will normally do well.
You have shown maxillary sinus included in your CTV in few cases, whatsoever you represented. Then the question
in upper alveolar
is whether maxillary sinus is part. Yeah. Okay.
So only
then,
in upper alveolar lesions.
Only in upper alveolar. Okay.
Only in upper alveolar lesions, and so there, of course, you know, that is exactly where the tumor would spread, and the entire maxillary sinus should be treated to 50 gray in those patients. As I said already, also that we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the infraorbital nerve is in that area, and that is actually traveling in the of the maxillary sinus.
Okay. So next question is asked, if the lesion is in lower buccoalveolar region, then should we include ITF?
Yes.
Even in that, even in lower buccoalveolar, we should include ITF.
Yes.
So even high ITF are only up to the base of his skull.
So as I mentioned, you see, once we are suggesting that this disease fails in the masticator space, and I mean, I am telling you this from, I'm sorry if it sounds a bit like, because there's no evidence about this. There's very little published evidence about this, except that
Yeah.
when you go through a lot of the literature, Yao et al., again, as I mentioned, Santam, Lai, all of them have talked about how patients fail in the infratemporal fossa. That is one of the major sites of failure of buccoalveolar cancers. Now, when we talk about the infratemporal fossa or the masticator space, we must understand that the temporalis muscle arises from there and is inserted superiorly, right? And that is where, so that is where we have often seen, I think, of the senior people in the participants will all remember seeing patients of buccoalveolar cancer who present with a big mass in this area. You know, this is, so we have treated up till this part, and just superior to that is where they fail. So yes, we need to treat all this entire area to at least 50 gray. Above the zygoma, we need to treat to 50 gray.
Next question is asked whether we should sacrifice cochlea if we needed to treat seventh nerve.
Yeah. So where are the situations where we will treat the seventh nerve? In a patient who has very, so seventh nerve, actually, if you see, even for the indications for perineural invasion following, what is recommended is that unless there is gross involvement, you don't include the facial nerve. You basically track the maxillary and the mandibular nerves. And in adenoid cystic carcinoma, you do treat the ipsilateral facial nerve. In that situation, yes, depends on whether your 60 gray volume is in that area or 50 gray volume is in that area. But yes, in that case, you would sacrifice the cochlea in the ipsilateral side.
Okay. What is the upper border of CTV suprazygomatic ITF?
So what I normally take it as, and again, this is a very personal decision, is the roughly approximately the superior border of the orbit.
So there are some question if the from the Cobalt Center, where in government center where the waiting list surgical waiting list is high, can we give neoadjuvant chemotherapy or metronomic methotrexate for waiting time? What is your experience? I think there is no recommendation, but
so I would say this, that we know that neoadjuvant chemotherapy is useful in downstaging oral cavity tumors. Okay. We know that. We have a paper from Tata Memorial which tells us that inoperable patients became operable when neoadjuvant chemotherapy was used. Recently, there's another paper which talks about the mandible, so being able to, spare the mandible. If we have to, if we are in a circumstance where we don't have the best possible option, then I guess it's all right to use neoadjuvant. This can't be based on, this is based on your particular need. I wouldn't recommend neoadjuvant methotrexate simply because its response rate is only 15%. So more aggressive chemotherapy, if we have to wait, I think is justified.
I think there is no recommendation for such indication.
Exactly.
If for waiting list, but there are certain condition if you surgeon want to make T4 operable, then we can use, but there is no level 1 evidence for the neoadjuvant. And next question is, if someone is sitting in Cobalt Center, then how to treat ITF? Then there maybe they are asking about 2D planning.
I can't say I've thought about that. I don't know the answer to that either. And I suppose you would have to tailor make to what you are able to do, because I think that's a very valid question. I think one of the ways you could deal with that would be, what I'm just thinking aloud, is that you could use sort of tip the head as far back as possible. That might allow you to gain access through your anterior beam into as high as possible. Let's put it that way, as high as possible. Maybe not up till the base of skull, but as high as possible.
Right, ma'am. And the next question is related to indication of retropharyngeal or retrostyloid nodal irradiation in node positive cases. When to treat these level of node?
So the retropharyngeal nodes actually, I suppose one would treat it only in a neck node positive situation, retrostyloid as well as retropharyngeals.
Next question is related to indication of concurrent chemotherapy. I think you covered,
yes.
But since it asked, you can briefly answer it.
So the standard recommendation for post-op CTRT is margin positive and node positive with ECE. However, the softer indications are PNI, LBSI, and the involvement of level 4 nodes. And these should definitely be considered in young patients where we would like to treat aggressively.
This is the interesting question. If someone develop orocutaneous fistula during treatment, then whether we should stop RT or continue RT?
No, I would think that we should, firstly, why has the orocutaneous fistula developed? If it is not because of residual disease, if it is because of, because the wound dehiscence has occurred, I think it would require a discussion with your surgeon. Is it possible to repair later? Is it possible to do a resurgery, follow it up with hyperbaric oxygen? In which case, after all, our primary aim is also to ensure that the disease should be controlled. So it would have to be individualized. If the surgeons tell you that yes, they can still patch it up, they can put a new patch, new flap, and you can give the patient hyperbaric oxygen, then you may as well complete it till, I don't know what the answer is what the textbook answer is, but I would do it this way. I would go ahead, I would complete it, and I would, after discussion with my surgeons, to find out whether they would be able to patch it up later. If they are not able to patch it up, then I think we are all in a slightly difficult situation. And I really don't know the answer to that.
Okay. The next is posted by Professor Punita Lal, and she thanks. It is a great presentation, and she also asked one question: how much do you rely on surgical clips when you top up the dose of 66 gray? Should I repeat? How much
I get it.
Yeah.
So I think more, I would say more that, if you know that a certain area, like you wish to treat the level 2, 3 nodes, this is something that you would possibly discuss with the surgeon, which is it, the node, which was the area. In which case, I think we would treat just that entire level. But yes, surgical clips would be helpful. What I'm trying to say is that it would be a discussion with the surgeons to find out exactly what they found in the area, and the clips would be helpful, and possibly likely also, we would end up treating the entire, the level, basically.
Next question, ma'am, is bolus necessary for scars?
To me, to my mind, it's a bit like, to my mind, it's like a value addition, you understand? In the sense that in the sense that we know that patients fail there, right? We know that patients, that is one area where kind of recurrences happen. So what we have been doing is that we've been 1 centimeter strip of bolus, just we fill up the cast in that area, just to make sure that the skin is not underdosed there. We might even lift the volume a little up to the skin in that area. So it's like, I feel it's like being extra careful. So you know that this is one area where the patient may fail, and therefore you make sure you do that extra effort to make sure that they don't fail there. I mean, how do we improve the outcome for the patient? We identify what is it that can improve the outcome, what is it that can reduce the chance of recurrence, and then you act on it. That is how incrementally you improve the outcome for patients. So this is also, it's like a step in that direction.
Dr. Arun, are you asking? Are you here?
Yeah, Dr. Rasi, please.
One question is it
Dr. Rasi?
मैं पूछती हूँ, चलिए. Is it necessary to include entire flap for node without extracapsular extension?
The flap is at risk. The flap is at risk. The flap has to be treated.
Okay, and ma'am, next question: what particular structure should be spared to reduce trismus, and what should be dose constant?
So there is some there are some studies which are indicating masseter, pterygoid. That dose to the masseter and the pterygoid actually reduce the risk, or anti-M joint, reduce the risk of developing trismus. But it's not possible in this situation because we need to include them, but perhaps the contralateral side could be spared. I don't, have a figure off the top of my head. I suppose we would say a mean dose of less than, 40 gray, but I don't have a figure that I can tell you that, this is the dose that we should prescribe to the masseter and pterygoid, but it's out there, it's been published. Somebody has published some literature on the masseter and the pterygoid.
Ma'am, next question is, will you include ipsilateral mandible in CTV when you are treating true buccal mucosa tumor?
Yes.
Next question is, if the patient is young and T2 and 0.
So I just want to specify here why. So we do know that basically how does this tumor travel? It travels along the gingivobuccal sulcus. It travels along the mucosa, mucosally and submucosally, involves the gingivum. That is the pattern of spread of the tumor. That is why I spent so much time discussing the pattern of spread. So this is not just a geometric expansion that we have to do. We have to understand how this disease spreads and then draw a target, which is why we come anteriorly. That is why traditional 2D method was you identified the angle of the mouth, because you needed to come anteriorly up to that. So similarly, yes, we need to treat the gingivum. We need to treat the gingivobuccal sulci, not just the lower, upper and lower.
Next question is, patient is having T2 and 0 disease, no risk factor except young age. Should we radiate?
It's a tough one. I don't know the answer to that. We would have to look at the margins, more than 5 millimeters, WPOI, LBSI, PNI. We could let him be if he doesn't have any adverse risk factors.
Actually, I think we can leave that patient. 30 years, see a buccal mucosa T2 and 0 without any risk factor, we can leave.
Yeah, but we would have to look at the pathology report very, very closely.
How in post-op RT indication, is it true if the patient has received neoadjuvant chemotherapy due to logistic issues? What will you do?
Sorry, come again.
In case of post-op RT, the patient has received neoadjuvant chemotherapy due to logistic issues. I think surgery, because of that surgery date. Then will you take that patient for radiotherapy?
Yes, very much. I don't think that changes. The T stage decides why. So it depends on what the T stage of the patient was. It would be better to treat rather than not. I mean, of course, it would be individual. I mean, if he has a T1 disease to begin with, if the neck nodes were assessed properly and there were no, that's, I mean, I don't know. I don't think there's a, yes or no answer to it. Every patient would have to be assessed, so if it was, for example, your T2 patient, the 30-year-old T2 who had no other risk factors, who had undergone neoadjuvant chemo, I suppose we could even think about treating him or not think about treating him. What I'm trying to say is there's no guideline. You would have to take an individual decision about whether to treat him or not treat him. I can't say I've thought about neoadjuvant chemotherapy for logistic reasons and then having to take a radiation decision is not something I can think of the top of my head and tell you.
Exactly, ma'am, exactly. And next question is practice changes of radiotherapy in COVID era. Do you change your practice? Did you change your practice in COVID era?
No, except that we were very careful about head and neck. When treating head and neck patients, we had to make sure that our staff was properly covered, wearing a surgical gown, wearing a mask, and wearing that face shield and gloves, because obviously in head neck, they are standing next to the patient and any patient could be becoming, he could have a COVID test negative last week, but he could still be COVID positive. For patients with tracheostomy, we started using something called an HME filter. Though we are not using it currently, but initially we did go through this situation that we started using an HME filter for those patients, just to make sure that our staff was not exposed. Otherwise we didn't change any dose fractionation. But that could even be a function of, how busy your department is. It's very difficult to change practice for a post-op head neck patient anyway. I would not recommend going more than 2 gray per fraction.
Treatment of xerostomia, post-operative xerostomia. Someone has asked.
So basically, of course, attention to dental hygiene, saliva, substitutes. I personally have very little experience with pilocarpine.
Dr. Rasi, I think it is 11:30. Now we should.
Questions are there. Yeah.
I would just want to ask last question with ma'am. Since you are a proton center practitioner, when you indicate proton therapy in buccoalveolar cancer, in which situation, whether recurrent or upfront?
So actually I removed that slide from, that was the last slide on my list, is that firstly, we must understand that the difference between the dose to the ipsilateral side and the contralateral side is very, very dramatic. So basically, as I said, now you have like the 6 gray isodose is also not going over to the other side. So definitely in a young adult, it is very much recommended. In an older person, in an elderly person, because you are going to improve the tolerance of the tumor, of the treatment. And if I may say so, if I may be honest enough to say so, anyone who can afford this treatment, I can see that at some point of time, proton therapy, when it becomes less expensive, is going to be the treatment of choice of head and neck cancer, because it reduces, after all, what is the whole aim of our IMRT, rapid arc, IGRT? We want to reduce those to the normal structures. The only thing that is preventing proton from becoming mainstream is that it is very expensive. At one point of time, 10 years from now, it is not going to be so expensive. So the discussion that we had 10 years ago for IMRT, and we were wondering who will we give IMRT to, is the discussion we are having for proton today. Everyone who can get IMRT, mostly, not infrahyoid lesions. Infrahyoid lesions, currently there isn't much advantage of giving proton therapy because there's nothing to spare. But for everyone else, whatever the indication of radiation, proton therapy gives a better dose distribution in terms of sparing the normal structures, whether it is tonsil, whether it is base tongue, whether it is nasopharynx, even oral tongue, as long as you're making sure that your cheek mucosa is separated nicely and the hard palate is away, the reactions are very much better. And I hope Rashi and Anu and you will invite me once to share our initial experience with proton therapy, because it is really very exciting. As radiation oncologists, I'm sure you'd love to see what we have been able to do in head and neck cancer. So I'm kind of angling for another invitation.
Yes, ma'am. We have a lot of question about proton therapy, but I think without seeing it, without experiencing it, it is difficult to understand. Uh, how is the experience about dosimetry in head and neck with proton therapy, since it is very irregular surface? Is surface matter?
So I will tell you that the one thing that matters in proton therapy is presence of metal inside the mouth. That is a big issue. You know, presence of metal inside the mouth. So we are very wary when we are treating these patients. We outline all their teeth. We speak to the dental surgeons, find out what is the material that is used. If possible, we check the CT stopping power of the material. If it's a titanium plate, we will, get the CT stopping power of the plate. Then when we are designing the field, we will design a field in such a way that the proton is not so-called looking at that metal at all. You know, it's bypassing the metal and everything's happening around the metal. So metal is one big issue. The surface is actually, like we have intensity modulated radiotherapy, and so similarly here we have the concept of robust optimization. In robust optimization, what happens is that the plan is made in such a manner that for a movement of 3 millimeters or any specified, you know, thing that you may have specified, or a difference in, the range of the proton of about 3.5% is accounted for in the planning. So that is why surface is not an issue, but yes, we keep a close eye to see if the depth is changing. For example, if the patient has weight loss, weight gain, edema, change of air cavity to fluid or fluid to air. So those things really impact. And for that, every day we do a cone beam CT and we pay attention to this besides positioning. And at every regular interval, we do what is called a QA-CT, where we do a CT scan and we overlay the plan on that, recalculate the plan and see what has been the impact.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a informative lecture and for your time. Now I would like to invite President UPRI, Dr. Anu. Are you, Dr. Anu? Dr. Rashi?
या मैं हूँ, हो सकता है मैम का डिस्कनेक्ट हो गया हो.
So let me just see whether I need to unmute her. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
No, I don't think she's there.
I think Dr. Rashi, you can give ma'am vote of thanks and closing remark. Since Dr. Anu, I think disconnected now.
Yeah, ma'am, we are highly thankful to you. Actually, I think हम लोगों का ये मतलब अपना था जो पूरा हो गया, आपसे कुछ सुने और पूरा मैम इतना मतलब हम लोग सभी लोग इंटरैक्ट हुए, तो we on behalf of UPRI I am highly thankful to you. आपने इतना डिटेल में समझाया. In future I hope कि प्रोटॉन थेरेपी हर जगह आएगा या जहाँ भी होगा आपके पास हम लोग आ पाएंगे, देखेंगे कैसे क्या हो रहा है. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Rashi. Thank you very much, Arun. And thank you very much, everyone who was there for the meeting.
Thank you so much, all participants. And one more thing, if you want any certificate, you can WhatsApp to me, Dr. Anu or Dr. Arun. We can give you certificate. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
मैम प्लीज एंड कर दीजिए अपनी तरफ से, क्योंकि आप होस्ट है ना. यू हैव टू.
ठीक. Thank you so much, Rashi, and thank you, Arun.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.